Good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's joined us for this launch of our Never More Needed film. Very excited about it. I'm going to start off with a little bit of housekeeping, first of all. So I'm Anna Fowlie from SCVO. We are recording this session today and it will be uploaded onto our website following the event for anyone to have a look at. If you want to ask questions when we get to the Q&A part of the session, if you put them in the Q&A function, you just keep the chat for chat, if you see what I mean. It's much easier to manage if we see actual questions that you would like answered by our speakers in the Q&A function. It is a webinar version of Zoom, so you will only be able to see the speakers. We won't be able to see any of the delegates, but we can certainly, you can make your presence felt in the chat and the Q&A box. What's all this about? Never More Needed came about because when the pandemic was really in full force, we kind of felt that we wanted to document what was going on. We wanted to make sure people were aware of all the fabulous stuff that was going on in the sector, and keep it for posterity as well as celebrating it at the time. It was a scary time. It was lots of really negative things happening, but there was also lots to celebrate. So we wanted to recognise and not lose track of all of that. And it turned out that our colleagues in other parts of the UK were also thinking the same way. So we collectively came up with the brand, if you like, of Never More Needed. And that got a lot of traction in Scotland, a lot more traction than it did in other parts. And it was all over social media. We've run lots of stuff through Third Force News, we've had webinars, and we really feel that it's been a good unifying brand for the sector, I suppose. And it's been used in quite powerful campaigns to get recognition for the sector as a whole and for different parts of it. But obviously, you can't say something's never more needed forever. So we're thinking that we need something that's a kind of product, almost as a last hurrah, I suppose, for the campaign. And my colleague Susan came up with the idea for a film, and that's what we've been making. So it's looking at really not only the crisis response of the sector, but also the role that the sector's got to play in Scotland as we emerge into the future, whatever that might look like. And I think it's really important that we hold on to that, and we hold on to that celebratory aspect. So what we're going to do is we're going to show the film, and then I'm going to welcome our three speakers that we have today. Kezia Dugdale from the John Smith Centre, Michelle Carruthers from Food Train, and Nigel Henderson from Penumbra. And we're going to get into a bit of a conversation. I'd like to invite Nigel and Kez and Michelle to join us now on the screen, as it were. Come up on the stage. So we're going to start with I'm so looking forward to being able to get up on a stage and wear some nice shoes, I have to say. So we're going to start with a few reflections, not about the footwear, but about what's been happening across Scotland in terms of the pandemic. And I suppose from my perspective, just to start off with, I think at the very beginning, we had a whole lot of real massive surge in demand and people having to change what they did to do things differently, but still with the same purpose. And people really uniting around the individuals in our communities and in the communities as a whole. And I do think that we had an amazing spirit and an amazing demand, but we also saw some parts of the voluntary sector just disappear and have to completely stop what they were doing. And I think it's really important that we remember that lots of stuff is coming back, and much more than obviously in the very early days. But there's so much that needs to be done in the future that is, and the contribution that the sector makes is much more than crisis response. But I also think it's really important to remember that this isn't over. People keep using the word post-pandemic. and we're not in post-pandemic, maybe we never will be. I think it'll no longer be a pandemic, but COVID will always be with us. But also so will the learning that we've all had through these times. And it's not all been a bad experience. We have also managed to progress a lot of things that we've wanted to progress for quite some time. So yeah, I think there's lots to learn and absolutely lots to celebrate and lots to look forward to. So I'm going to hand over to Kez first, if you'd like to give us some reflections.
I was going to start by showing you my slippers and by confessing that I'll quite happily never put a real pair of shoes back on again if I can avoid it. And just to carry on from where you started there, Anna, I think that point about the pandemic not being over is absolutely critical. I think what we're seeing is the end of a health crisis and the beginning of an economic crisis. And I know you're going to ask us to talk about the future in the next round of remarks. And I've got quite a bit I want to say about that. I'll park that for now. But I wanted to say two things in opening. One about an involvement I have with an organisation called Together, which has done a massive study of UK public opinion about how healthy our society is, what we mean by community today, how united or how divided we are as a people. And I will say something about that in a second. But I'm also now in my post-politician life a trustee of two voluntary sector organisations. I'm on the board of Systema Scotland and I'm also on the board of Shelter across the UK. And I've recently just joined the oversight board of the Promise. So I feel like I've got a bit more of an insight into the third sector in practice than I did when I was in Parliament. And I just want to offer a brief reflection on what the pandemic has meant to each of those organisations. And firstly, from Shelter's perspective, being a huge organisation very reliant on income from its network of shops, it had a very instant, very hard revenue problem about how to maintain staff and how to continue all of its services. And it had to adapt so quickly and it lost out a lot of money without question. But it managed to do things like organise an online carol concert, which was watched by hundreds of thousands of people across the UK, which made up a lot of that difference in falling revenue. So I think that type of innovation has been replicated right across the sector in so many different ways, which speaks to the real inherent creativity of the sector, which I'm not sure we celebrate often enough. From Systema's perspective, it's an organisation which is rooted in relationships. It's all about getting young disadvantaged people in some of the most deprived communities in Scotland in a room using musical instruments to build their confidence and their networks and their relationships and their sense of self. How do you instantly replicate that in an online world? It could have shut down the organization, just the sheer fear of how to move to a digital environment when you're so used to being in halls and community centres and in school environments. But they did it, and not only did they do it brilliantly by getting all these young people and having online choirs and one-to-one music lessons through devices like this in a way that was never imagined before. It opened up a whole new possible way of doing things in the future. So instead of just working in 4 communities across Scotland, there's now the potential to use these digital assets that have been created in every part of the country if we set the right terms from that, if we fund it in the right way, if we understand its limitations, but also its possibilities. So there is some good in that, as well as there's been a kind of lot of adaptation and change forced on an exhausted workforce who are already working at their limits before the pandemic started. And finally, the promise is still a promise. It still has a lot of work to do. But what I think it speaks to is the desperate need to turn government promises into action. And I think there is this question of how do you implement all the good ideas, whether it be the social renewal board that you've been working on, Anna, or all the other different big groups, reports, reviews we've had in the past 12 months into action. The Fowlie review and what it means for a national care service being another great example of having a litany of things we know we need to do, but we now need to turn them into actual actions. I think is something that everybody is very focused on now. And if we don't live up to those expectations, we'll find ourselves yet again having the same conversations. And all of those are odd strengths to have over the past 12 months around, being thrifty, being nimble, being adaptive. And I describe them as odd strengths because actually they're survival instincts, more so than they are strengths, because the third sector's always had to find means to survive because it's always been under the cosh. And I think we need to talk really frankly about that. Are we forever still going to be demanding 3-year funding cycles from government and, dealing with Cinderella terms and conditions, watching other people get better service than we do as a sector? But that's perhaps for the second section around the future. Just finally, on the work that I've been doing with Together. So we've done a massive survey of UK public opinion, just under 250,000 people, about what the pandemic's been like for people over the past 12 months. The positives are that we do have a greater sense of community. We know our neighbours better. 400,000 people have done volunteering for the first time in a way that they had never previously considered. Great assets, great reasons to be cheerful, but we've also seen spiralling levels of isolation, spiralling levels of loneliness, and a real epidemic in poor mental health that will have long-term ramifications. There is also a lot to say about the degree to which we are more divided than we've ever been before and more intolerant of people who hold different views from ourselves. But I'm going to speak about why I think that's critical in the next section, Anna, and I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Kez. I recognise a lot of what you're saying there, and that whole turning rhetoric into reality is something that's dear to my heart. We have got lots of policies and reports. We just need to GFDI. So, Michelle, would you like to give us some thoughts?
Thanks, Anna, and thanks very much for having Food Train along today, and lovely to see members and volunteers from a new service that we launched in response to the pandemic featuring in the film there, so that's lovely. For me, the voluntary sector's remarkable response to the pandemic was no surprise. While we hadn't experienced working in this type of circumstances before, responding to crisis and trauma and supporting people and communities is our absolute bread and butter. At Food Train, 1,000 new older people came to us for help in the first 6 weeks. And over the rest of the year, another 1,000 have come to us for help. And since the start of the pandemic, we've been supporting around 4,000 older people in total. And on the 23rd of March, 1/3 of our volunteers had to step away. So when you talk about impact and what that meant for us, it's been significant. But on the back of that, 1,200 new volunteers have come to us, have come through our doors over the last year, some staying some days, some able to give weeks, some for months, and some still with us. And our staff together worked 1,600 more hours than usual in the first couple of months alone. We were doing around 6,000 deliveries a month of fresh food and groceries out to older people, 78% more than pre-COVID levels. We're still now averaging 50% more than pre-COVID levels. So when you talk about impact, we're not quite at that stage yet of having the opportunity to pause and really think about what it means for us as an organisation. We're still getting through the days. We took on calling our older members because of their distress, their worry, their fear and their loneliness. And we made 10,000 phone calls in 6 months alone. We started off hoping we might get round and do a few hundred, but the need was really there. We set up a new service to match volunteers with older people in parts of Scotland where our bases couldn't reach at that point. And we had volunteers who cooked and shared over 13,000 lovely, nutritious home-cooked meals with our older neighbours. And collectively as a team, staff and volunteers, we've given over hundreds and thousands of hours to listening, to talking, reassuring and taking real practical steps in keeping everybody safe around about us. It's taken a phenomenal effort across Food Train to help keep our members, our older members, feeling safe, feeling cared for, well fed and less alone. It's been hugely challenging, emotional and tiring, but our response was never in doubt. As a voluntary sector organisation, it's in our DNA to respond to what people need, to really listen, to be nimble with solutions, to mobilise and organise and to collaborate, but to care and to serve. We didn't have to change a huge amount about what we do, but we just had to do so much more of it, and we had to do it quickly, but really calmly. And when everything round about you is in chaos, that in itself is a big challenge. And it's all been possible because of the amazing people that we have with fabulous skills and knowledge, brilliant relationships and great networks and lots of trust. But what of the impact on our older members who have been behind their doors for so long the loneliness, the deterioration in their motivation to self-care, because what's the point anymore? The ability to get out and about and meet people taken away from them, their world very small and restricted to some rooms in their garden if they had one. So what of their impact longer term? And I think we will see a wave of ramifications on our older population, and that will have quite a knock-on impact as we go forward. And what about our staff and our volunteers who are still working at these really high levels, and how long can we sustain this as we continue forward supporting older people, but also trying to bring back on stream some of the services, the more face-to-face services that we had to stop. So we're hopeful that we'll get a bit of time as this year progresses on, that we'll be able to take a step back and consider that. It's been a time of immense worry and sadness at times, but yet there have been amazing moments of joy and of hope and tremendous giving and love that we all need to hold on to, because that's what's getting us through. Without doubt, COVID has brought so much darkness, but I think it really has shone a really golden glow on the amazing talent, resilience and kindness among people in Scotland and Scotland's voluntary sector. And I hope those are the things that carry us forward to a better place.
Thank you, Michelle. That was really thoughtful and really insightful. It's amazing. I was impressed when I came to visit Food Train at what you did a few years ago, and you know, in this new setting as well. It's just astonishing what you guys managed to achieve. It's phenomenal. So, Nigel, over to you. Tell us what it's like in the world of mental health. Busy, I suspect.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So for people who don't know me, I'm Nigel Henderson and Chief Executive of Penumbra, and we work in mental health, as Anna suggested. And, you know, the work we do is largely commissioned by local authorities or the integrated joint boards. We were able to move fairly quickly, and I guess for two reasons. One, that we could see what was happening, and actually about a week before the official lockdown, we asked staff to step back from as much face-to-face support as they could. I mean, the services we offer range from a couple of hours of support a week through to 24/7 residential services. So we've got quite a range of different activities going on. But we took a decision early to sort of move. We were told that we should expect anything up to 30, 40, 50% staff absence because of COVID. And we were starting to really panic actually about how we were going to keep some of our core services going. That didn't come to fruition, and I really take my hat off to staff. They've kept themselves safe and they've kept the people they work with safe, and that's been fantastic. And we haven't actually seen a significant increase in absence from work over the last year, which has been phenomenal. We've also had to understand how to recruit people differently and how to work in an online environment to actually get a sense of people. You know, and an awful lot of what we look for are those sort of characteristics of compassion, empathy, understanding of our sector, the values that people bring. And some of those are much easier to gauge in a face-to-face situation than they are in an online situation. But nonetheless, we've managed that, and we've done that successfully. I think the other thing that helped us was really the fact that over the last 18 months, 2 years, we've invested heavily in digital transformation. I mean, quite a significant investment, actually. And we went live with our new software systems in January of 2020. And if we hadn't done that, a lot of our work would have been a lot more complicated. We had a fully integrated system. We'd given all our staff smartphones or tablets. And basically people could work from anywhere, and they could connect into our main systems. They could get all they needed. If we hadn't had that fortuitous sort of timing, we would have been really stuck with very old systems that didn't speak to one another, that weren't easy to access outside the main office and so on. So we feel very lucky that we had made that investment. And I know that for others, that was a real challenge. I think the other thing that we've tried to do is to take a proportional sort of approach to how we support people. So, you know, we get to know the people we support fairly well, and we were able to make a bit of an assessment about their needs in terms of who would cope best with telephone or video support, and who would maybe need a more blended approach where we would still maintain the face-to-face and do that in a sort of socially distanced way. But, you know, there are times when it is still, there is nothing like actually seeing someone face-to-face and having that physical presence. So our staff have used that approach to really think about people, and that's ebbed and flowed over the last year. So some people have had better times than others. Others have struggled at times, but we've been able to step up or step back depending on what's happening. In fact, by last September, October, we were almost up to 90% of our pre-COVID sort of operations in terms of being out there face-to-face. That obviously took a step back again in December when we went into a further lockdown. But I think the other thing for us is that, as I say, our services are commissioned by the integrated joint boards. What we've experienced over the last year is something I very much hope that we will see in the future. And I'll sum it up in one word: trust. The ability to trust us to get on to do the right thing, that we don't need to be constantly monitored or micromanaged or have requirements to submit endless amounts of returns and all the rest of it. Although at the beginning of COVID, we were getting daily requests for information about staff numbers, about anyone who was ill or any signs of symptoms and so on. And we weren't getting it from just one organisation, we were getting it from 2 or 3 organisations. So thankfully that has settled down, and we have a single way of reporting a lot of these things now. And I think everyone was in the same position where all of a sudden we thought we need data, we need information, we need to know what's happening. But actually I think we've now moved into a more balanced rhythm around that. I've also been struck by the fact that part of what we also do with people is help connect them to their local resources within their communities. And I've been so impressed by how communities have stepped up and self-organized and really help people, you know, whether that's doing shopping for them, picking up prescriptions, even just making a phone call to a neighbor or something like that has been really helpful. And we've been able to connect into some of that. And in fact, I don't know if it's a made-up word or if it's one I've invented, probably not. But I think it goes beyond volunteering. I think what we've seen is communitying, where actually there are people who are both giving and getting back as much for themselves in that sense. And I do think that that role of communitying has been really significant in the pandemic. And I hope it continues. And I guess this longer sort of lockdown that we've had just now, we've seen people get tired, we've seen people get exhausted by it. We've seen people perhaps give up hope a little. And, you know, and that's certainly a concern for me as we look forward. And I know that's the next section, but something about how people have maybe lost some sense of hope, how some people certainly that we work with have had very dark ideas actually about their own future. And I think that is something that we really need to be aware of. We don't have a lot of real-time data about whether there's an increase in suicide or not yet. I mean, I think the hunch would be that there are some people who've suffered greatly and perhaps reached that very, that sort of breaking point in their lives. But you know, we need to really think about some of that as we move forward. I think that what we've also done is really connect with our staff in a different way. So we're all much more familiar with Zoom and Teams and all the rest of it. But actually, in some ways, what we've done is perhaps had more regular sessions with a wider range of staff. We've had drop-in sessions, which weren't easy before. We've got staff working across 20 local authority areas in Scotland, and often all they ever see is their immediate team. But actually, we've been able to connect people across wider geography because of Zoom. And I sort of wonder why we didn't think about it before, but actually it's become commonplace. And again, that's something I hope is going to stick. So I'll stop there and just say that, you know, it's been tough, but I'm just really, really proud of our team and our staff, the way they have stepped up, and the people that we support and their flexibility to meet us halfway and to work with us to actually find solutions rather than always to look for problems. So thank you to them all.
Thank you, Nigel. Again, really inspiring stuff. And I recognise a lot of what you're saying in terms of that digital capacity building. We were so lucky at SCVO to have really good tech and already be using Zoom and things like that. But certainly what we've seen with our digital capacity building services has been huge demand on people who've been quite resistant, suddenly realising that they have to get into that space now, but actually then realising it was a good thing. So that's been interesting, and that connection of staff across Scotland as well and across different parts of the organisation. People feel more connected than they did despite not seeing each other, which is great. So if we think about the future, and I think again, as thinking about the past in a way, it swings and roundabouts. Probably there's good things and bad things. Thinking about what you said, Kezia, in your opening remarks about the kind of perennial cry for 3-year funding or whatever. One thing that I would say is quite encouraging is in all the 5 main parties' manifestos, we've got proper commitments around, and I know we've had the words before, we need the action, but they've all recognised that some sort of sustainability of funding really needs to be done. So I think we've got a moment here, we've got a wee moment where everybody's kind of genuinely recognised the value of the sector, but translating that into action, that's a whole other thing. So give us your thoughts on all of that, Kez.
If you're in a good mood and you want to stay that way for the rest of the day, I suggest you go make a cup of tea, because I've got nothing but misery for the next few minutes for you, I'm afraid. I'm not sure this is what you invited me on for, but it's what you're getting, Anna, and you'll not do it again. I want to say something about money, and then something about the kind of political culture that we're living in just now, because these are unavoidable topics, and kind of 2 categories on money. First of all, manifestos. You just mentioned the manifestos there. And I'm really pleased that there is that commitment to 3-year funding, but like you, I've kind of heard it before, and it's really just got to happen now. And how do we make it happen is back to that point about the implementation gap that we discussed earlier. But here's the thing, the Institute for Fiscal Studies have panned all of the political parties comprehensively this week for their manifestos just not adding up. And that's because they don't just add up at all. At best, the promises that have been made are funded for the first year of the next Parliament, and it gets very, very difficult and beyond that. Now, the only way that you can make the sums add up is by either making cuts elsewhere or by increasing taxes. And you don't see a huge amount of appetite from any of the parties to do either of those 2 things across their manifestos. So there's trouble afoot, without question. Unless something significant happens. So I've just started a new podcast. This is my plug, called Spotlight at the University of Glasgow, and we speak with academics each week about various trends. And last week we had the economist Danny Blanchflower on. He was arguing that 50% of shuttered businesses across the country will not reopen. So that's left me in a mindset where I'm fully anticipating mass youth unemployment by Christmas, unless the UK government do what Joe Biden's done in America, and that's to spend big now. So the idea that furlough won't come to an end, but it will be replaced by new mechanisms to support vulnerable jobs in the economy, and in particular young people in industries most susceptible to the economic side of the pandemic crisis. So if he spends big, there could be a lot of additional money coming Scotland's way, which could be spent to fulfil these promises that are in the manifestos. If they don't carry on spending big, and bear in mind, we've got, one of the most right-wing chancellors in my adult lifetime spending like a left-wing 1970s Labour figure at the minute. The ideology is out of place as much as the policies are welcome. Can that be sustained forever? He's got a choice to make. Does he go down the Biden route and keep spending and then the money flows into Scotland, or do they they go back to the David Cameron-esque austerity of 2010 to 2015, and where does that get us? So that's going to be pivotal, just seeing what the UK government does next. And the Queen's speech is going to give us a sense for just how much worse things can become. But I'm really, really worried about that. And then finally, a point about political culture that I wanted to make. So we're living in a globalized world full of populism just now. And what populism does is it's forcing us into tribes, and we get very comfy in our tribes, and we surround ourselves with people who think like us, behave like us, and are like us, and we become less tolerant of people that are different to us. And that means that our debate and the culture that we're living in is increasingly toxic. It's angry. Like if you watched the TV debate last night, the one word you would use for it was just bloody angry, and none of that is good. But what I think is going to make it worse, and this is where my misery piles in again, Anna, I'm sorry, is that all of the places where we meet people who are different from us are in decline too, right? So churches, trade unions are in decline, youth work is in decline, increasingly community assets we know are in decline. Just need to look at the debate in Glasgow around how we fund libraries, community centres. I know it's not just in Glasgow, it's across the whole of the country, but the physical infrastructure for where we meet people that are different from us are also in decline and deeply susceptible to austerity and further cuts. And after the pandemic, the workplace, the place where most people meet people different from themselves, could also be in decline too, because of Zoom and all the changing working environment. So I'm very worried about what constantly being forced into tribes is going to do to the nature of our politics and how our politicians make decisions, because populism really means that they only ever govern for half the country, and that's the country that votes for them. So that's my doom mongering for today. I have lots of ideas about the small things we can do to try and turn that around, but I think starting with that context is probably quite an important place to start, even if it's grim beyond belief, Anna.
Just give us a little taster of some of your thoughts about what we could do to make it better.
Well, I do think there's a massive role for the third sector in being that place where we bring people together. But that's back again to the point about money. That has to be funded. So we need the government to understand the dangers of this kind of toxic culture and to help create the institutional environment that can overcome it. So fund community centres, fund sport, fund music, fund the third sector properly, fund the idea of relationships and community being an integral part of a functioning economy and a functioning society. That takes us all back to the kind of well-being agenda, which I know many people on this call will be very, very bought into. And that also takes us back to the implementation gap. We have to just start doing this stuff, and we have to get people to believe in it. And I appreciate a lot of that falls on politicians. So how do you change politicians' mind? Well, I'm involved in other research just now, which is about demonstrating that this tribal, angry political rhetoric isn't working. You're only ever speaking to your own people if you do that. So if you want to retain power, if you want to persuade people to your cause, you have to get back into that art of changing how you talk, building those relationships and building those networks. That's part of the answer, but God, I mean, we could talk for days about this, but I've just thrown that challenge out there. It all comes back to implementation.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I've listened to a really interesting podcast on the demise of nuance, and it really, really resonated with me. I just think that polarized society that we're living in, it's not just here, it's all over. It's just so unhealthy, and everything's, awful or awesome. There's nothing that's just in the middle. I would quite like a bit of just, in the middle. That's not like me, to be honest. So well, let's just stick with the order. Michelle, would you like to give us some of your thoughts for the future?
Well, not easy to go just after Kez, who is much more of an authority on a lot of this political stuff than I am. So I can just talk from the perspective of being someone who's been in an organisation throughout this. And I think I can absolutely see that what the sector did not need was politicians to help them make decisions. That in terms of opportunities for the third sector has got so much skill and expertise, and is the length and breadth of the country working in all of these thematic areas and issues that we've seen raised in things like the calls to action in the Social Renewal Advisory Board. And what has happened has been the widening of these gaps and inequalities in societies, issues that have had hundreds, if not thousands, of strategies and policies written about them, but have lacked any real boldness or sincerity, I have to say, in terms of implementation. And we are rapidly becoming known as the country who's great at writing and talking about stuff, but rubbish at doing in that sense. And I think if you look at the calls to action in the Social Renewal Advisory Board report, there's no surprises there. But what's sad is that we're still having these same conversations about these issues. You can take everything back to tackling poverty, to inequalities, to hunger, to exclusion, taking power and facilities and resources away from communities. That's the themes you read in all of them. And in tandem, you can come up within your mind a huge raft of organisations that you know are working in these areas, that have got skills and expertise. And if we matched up the quality of our sector's ability and our sector's expertise with quality of local governance and resources, then I think we'd be starting to get in the right direction. And throughout the pandemic, it's been by necessity rather than being any good design that we've looked at things through a public health lens and a rights-based lens. And that's what we've got to hold on to. We can't go back to saying we're just going to look at that topic. We've got to be questioning, is this good for everybody? And how are we going to know? We're going to have to ask them. So it's time for some grown-up conversations. And I think the thing that concerns me the most is that I don't get any real sense that we've got enough politicians out there behind there who are bold and brave, but we as people could be.
I think that's a really interesting point, Michelle, isn't it? Because politicians respond to what voters want them to do. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of thing there about how do you put pressure in from that perspective. So just before I come to you, Nigel, I've had a question about will we share the link to the film on Facebook? So yeah, absolutely, we'll put it on all our social media channels, and the film and the webinar session will be shared very widely to be as accessible as possible. So Nigel, would you like to give us some hopeful thoughts?
Well, I'll try. You know, my favourite quote, Anna, just on that last subject you were saying about what the public wants, you know, and Paul Weller famously said, the public wants what the public gets. I'm not sure that's true. I think that this has opened people's eyes to new possibilities and that we don't just want more of the same. From my perspective, particularly working in the mental health field, you know, I think mental health and well-being has never been more in the spotlight. When I started in this sector so many years ago, we were crying out to get anything in the newspaper, on the radio or whatever. Now it's everywhere. And I think there's a new understanding of what our well-being is and what we might need from one another, what we need as a society in terms of that. But again, you know, going back to Kezia's point about the implementation gap, we've got lots of good policies. We have some really good policies, whether that's self-directed support, the idea behind integration and all the rest of it, but actually putting it into action, we very much see tribes being created within some of those settings as well. So I hope we can get beyond some of that and start to find solutions. Certainly, you know, as Michelle said, that sense of the human rights and public health sort of approach, I think, is beginning to become much more apparent. I think there is a big role for Public Health Scotland in the future, and particularly around not just mental health and well-being, but around communities and what we mean by community. I mean, you know, I reflect on my life over the last year, and I have spent more time in the area where I live than the area where I work. Whereas previously I would have probably associated, not my community, but my community was to some extent my work rather than where I live at home. But we've now got WhatsApp groups and all sorts of things, people out walking, standing at the door, chatting to one another. You know, it's a very different environment. And I think that notion that 50% of businesses might not open up again is really quite gobsmacking in a way. But it also, I think, reflects the pattern of how people will live their lives post-pandemic. So we might have more blended ways of working, so that we're actually spending a couple of days at home, maybe a couple of days in the office. What does that mean for those businesses that in the past have purely existed to support the office culture, if you like? Do they have to relocate out to suburban areas, rural areas? Is there going to be an explosion of different businesses happening, mobile businesses, things like that? I don't know, but I think there are some both opportunities, but also some desperate challenges as well. In terms of mental health, I think one of the things that I'm hopeful of is that we actually listen to people a bit more. And put that lived experience more at the center of any collaborative approaches about redesign. I think we've become too fixated in the past with assessing people for eligibility for a service and actually then signposting them somewhere else and saying, sorry, you're not eligible for this service, but you can go down the street or try this door. And I hear the phrase, no wrong door. That to me sounds like a fairly negative one. And someone suggested to me that we should actually be talking about every door is the right door. So how do we actually make sure that we're offering people some sort of compassion, some sort of listening, and some sort of validation? We're not putting them through an eligibility test to see if they fit into that particular service, but how are we actually giving them the time and the space and the compassion to be heard? And sometimes, not always, but sometimes that can be enough. Just having that space and feeling that you're not alone, feeling that you're validated. So we've invested a lot in creating a workforce that has 20% of our workforce are now people with their own lived experience of mental ill health. And they bring a real asset to us as an organization in terms of being able to share their own experiences with people. And that has to be done carefully. You have to make sure you're not leaving yourself vulnerable. But I think we've developed a skill and an expertise in being able to support that. And I think that whole sense of people's lived experience being much more to the fore and dictating is the wrong word, guiding perhaps the solutions that we aim for in the future. So I'm hopeful that mental health has found its place now. The National Care Service is going to put social care on the same footing as the NHS, because I think we've now understood the importance of social care in the wider society, that we all have a need for support. None of us are independent in that true sense. We're not islands. We actually all are interdependent, and we should probably stop using the word independence. We should talk about, or independent, we should talk about being interdependent and that connection and connectivity that we all need.
I don't share your optimism that the National Care Service is the answer to that, but I'm very, very hopeful that you're right. So I suppose it depends what it looks like. But I think one of the themes that's coming up in some of the points that are in the chat and the questions is also coming up from what you're all saying. So do we think that kind of, Nigel's point about every door is the right door, Michelle talking about working with local partners, and we're all talking about how, and Kezia in terms of the tribe thing, we've all been talking about how that working together and cooperation, collaboration, whatever you want to call it, has actually been really good, and the trust issue as well. Is there something we would probably all want that to continue? Is there something structural that needs to make that happen, or is that much more about it being a philosophical change or an attitudinal change? One of the things that came up at our hustings was parity of esteem for the third sector, and that public services are often better delivered. The First Minister said on that hustings, some services delivered by the NHS would be better delivered by the voluntary sector. I've not seen her say it anywhere else, and it's not in the manifesto. However, she did say it publicly and it's on record. So I just wonder if there's something structural that needs to be done to achieve that, or is it, anyone got any views on that? Is that too wishy-washy, really a question?
Is it something structural, or is it actually trying to bottle what I think is often one of the key unique selling points, if you like, of the third sector? And I think it's that emphasis on the greater good sometimes. It's not the emphasis on simply building an organization or building an empire. And there's something about that commitment to our values and using those values to guide us. Now, I'm not saying that other parts of the public service system don't have values, but they do tend to be trumped by processes and procedures and risk assessments and things like that. We're not totally without risk assessments and all the rest of it, but I do think there is something about seeing possibilities rather than problems. So is it actually about changing the infrastructure, or is it about changing the mindset and the culture more commonly? I'm just sticking that out there.
I suppose that's what's going through my mind. Is it a cultural thing? And it relates to a question that Carolyn Sawyers from Cora's brought up in the question and answer, which is that where's the appetite and how do you influence that appetite? And it's a kind of a big synergy, isn't it, of media, politicians, public, and indeed voluntary organisations themselves, who can be quite competitive and not all collaborative. So I think there's some interesting questions there as well. Kez, have you got any thoughts about how we bring about that more harmonious, joined up kind of world?
It's a positive that's come out of the crisis, isn't it? It's these new ways of, well, they're not new, but these enhanced ways of doing things have come out of a period where it kind of had to be done. So how do you make that sustainable and permanent? Well, for me, when you're talking about how you promote a culture, it is both people's attitudes and the infrastructure which supports it. And that takes me back to the point about time. People need to have more time and to be less pressured and to feel like they're in a less competitive environment in order for these good cultural practices to be sustained. So I'm afraid that does take you back to 3-year funding cycles, because if you're not on that at the very least, if not more, then you're only ever really operating at your full capacity for 9 months out of the 12 in a year. So basic things like that could buy back time, where you can sit back and look at your cultures and look at how you best promote collaboration and remove this competitive element, I think is a key part of it. And the parity point, I think, is really well made. We've been talking about this forever as well. I mean, we were talking about this, the Christie Commission, when I first got into Parliament, and now I'm well and truly out of it. I'm sure if I'm bored of it, you guys must just be incredulous at the idea. We're still talking about this and it hasn't happened already. It's just got to change.
Michelle, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yes, for me it's about legacy, and that there must be some legacy for the voluntary sector on this. And I think I've always objected to the term third sector, because it makes us sound like we're a bit of something else, or the fourth emergency service. And we're often the first thing that people think of when they have some kind of need in their home or their community or with themselves. And I think, yes, there's been lots of positive narrative and lots of warm words about the value of the voluntary sector in supporting Scotland through the pandemic. But how does that now translate in terms of funding and relationships and opportunities? And unless you change the infrastructure of the relationships that we have with the public sector, which is a purchaser-provider relationship, then it doesn't matter how much you talk about this, nothing is going to change. And I think if you look at the principles of Christie, and even if you take integration an example, what has changed? You know, we chunks of our organisations sitting at the end of March not knowing if we were coming to work on the 1st of April. And until those fundamental things shift, and I can't, as somebody who runs an organisation, drive that shift. We as a sector can come together and shout really loud about it, but there has to be a way that the public sector and the third sector can see each other more as equals and proper partners before I think we achieve some of these things. But
Yeah,
the sector can also be better at doing these things together, and I think we've shown that we can, so we mustn't go back.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And I do think that the whole concept of that, you know, it's like back to the 80s of client contractor split type stuff when competitive tendering was first brought in. That's when I was very first a baby HR worker, do you know, oh my goodness. and we've still got the legacy of that. And on the other side of the public sector funding is it's grant giving, which is a very passive, it puts you into a very passive thing, and there's a very controlling, born out of understandable risk aversity in some cases, but it does completely change the relationship. It's not parity of esteem if you have to get a grant to, you know, to help you just live, and it's not if you're in that client contractor customer provider thing, you know, that's not, doesn't help parity of esteem either. We do have to remember that quite a big chunk, right, half the sector's funding does actually come from you know, individual donations, from fundraisers, from trading, from, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So it's very different for different parts of the sector, and I think that's something that government particularly hasn't got their head around. They tend to think that really it's Scottish Government funding that's saving everybody. It's really not. So it's probably about, I don't know, I'm not going to even, I've learned this week I can't do percentages, so I'm not going to try. But yeah, so we're just going to come into the end of this session. So I just wanted to ask, so one sentence from each of you on how has this helped us learn for the next big crisis, which I think is probably the climate emergency, but you might want to choose another one. What have we, or not make up a crisis. What do you think? What do you think we've learned in terms of that crisis response?
Silos can be abandoned with political will.
Cool.
It's one of those moments where your mind just goes blank.
I know.
I was just thinking about the best way to say that looking at everything through the lens of public health will get us a long way forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm struggling. I mean, I think that you know, I do think the next few years there are big challenges. I hope that those challenges are not, they go beyond some of the socioeconomic, and I think there is a real opportunity to actually build better communities and better support within those communities. And we shouldn't lose that sense of communiteering that I think we have built, but it could be lost very quickly if we don't make use of it now.
Yeah, I suppose, so my reflection or my sentence would be that what you do in a crisis is, in that kind of gold command thing, is you focus on the outcome that you want to achieve, you focus on the difference that you want to make and who you want to make it with, and you don't focus on what cost centres are coming out of, who's paying for it. I mean, obviously you can't forget there's money involved, but you think about the outcome and the person or the community, and then everything else has to deliver on that rather than the system coming first. And if it happens to deliver, then that's all grand. So
there's probably three things there. There are things we should stop doing, things we should start doing, and things we should keep doing. And maybe in the pandemic, we have kept everything going and added more layers onto it, but actually with a bit of reflection, are there things that we could actually let go now? And I think it's about evidence as well. How do we, so Michelle talked about how we're all busy doing the do, as it were, a lot of the time, and we are. And I guess for me, one of our slight weaknesses sometimes is that we are not able to compete with the evidence and the data that is generated by other parts of the public sector, or in my world, by the medical or academic worlds. How do we evidence that what we do really makes a difference beyond the anecdotal? And I think things like this help, but also I think we need to find ways of capturing some of that. And people's experiences are the evidence. The outcomes for people are the evidence.
Absolutely, and we have to get a lot better. I think we collectively as Scotland, that's not just us as a sector, that we have a key role in it to be better at that. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to close us up now by saying thank you. So thank you to everybody for who's joined us as a delegate. I see most people have stayed right through the whole session, which is great. It's not always the way, so really appreciate everybody staying with us. And really thank you to Nigel, Kez and Michelle for your really interesting reflections and thoughts. I think it's been well, I found it interesting. Well, that's the most important thing, no? But also everyone that was involved in making the film, so Media Co-op, as aforementioned, Penumbra, Food Train, Cornerstone, Scouts Scotland, Homestart, Maryhill Integration Network, and everyone that gave us, you'll have noticed at the end of the film, our offices in Edward House in Sucky Hall Street in Glasgow, we're dressed up, jazzed up with all the images as well that were used for the film and more. So they're looking great, and that's a high street presence for Never More Needed. And so thanks to everyone who gave us the images for that. And again, thanks very much to Keegan and Pennykid, not just for supporting the making of this film, but for the support that you give us at SCVO on an ongoing basis. We do really appreciate it. And finally, I want to remind everyone that its charity awards have been launched for 2021. Last year, because we had an online event, we had over 5,000 people join us on YouTube and online. So we're hoping to have a real life event this year, but also to keep some of that online engagement, because it was just fantastic. So we've got 9 categories, some of them are new, and we would encourage you, the stuff's all on our website. Closing date's 14th of May, so if you know any part of the sector, person, organisation, campaign or whatever that was been Never More Needed in 2020 to 21, then please nominate so that we can get a really good cross section. And we have a new award this year in terms of climate conscious as well, so we're hoping to raise some awareness of that through this process. So thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for joining us.